Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Hermione Granger is the embodiment of intelligence, courage, and determination. She never feared breaking the rules, saved her friends, and sometimes found a way out where there seemed to be no hope. But even geniuses make mistakes. In her biography, there are moments when decisions made with confidence and persistence could have led to disaster, not only for her, but for the entire wizarding world. From naive fascinations to dangerous miscalculations, let's look at Hermione's most striking blunders. Enjoy watching. Number 1. The cat hair. In the Chamber of Secrets, even the usually cautious and calculated Hermione made a serious mistake. Deciding to use Polyjuice Potion, she found a hair on her robe after a scuffle with Millicent Bulstrode. Logic told her it belonged to her rival, but as it turned out, it was a cat hair. The result? A painful and dangerous transformation that had to be treated in the hospital wing. It's surprising that such a brilliant witch didn't take basic precautions to ensure the ingredient was safe. Number 2. Displaying Dumbledore's army list for all to see. During Dolores Umbridge's reign at Hogwarts, Hermione was the main driving force behind the creation of Dumbledore's army. She came up with a way to magically enchant the list of members so that any traitor would be punished. But she made an unforgivable mistake, keeping that list in plain sight. When it ended up in Umbridge's hands, every member of the group was put at risk. For such a careful girl, this was an astonishingly short-sighted move. Number 3. Cormac McLaggen. Hermione was known for being rational, but emotions can throw even the most level-headed witch off balance. When she saw Ron start dating Lavender Brown, Hermione decided to take revenge by going to the Christmas party with Cormac McLaggen, a boy she had no real feelings for. She hoped to make Ron jealous, but instead she ended up with nothing but awkwardness and regret, a move that's hard to justify logically. Number 4. Not believing Harry's theory about Malfoy. In The Half-Blood Prince, Harry suspected that Draco Malfoy had become a Death Eater and was working on a dangerous plan. He saw Draco's strange behavior, noticed his visit to Borgin and Burke's, and was convinced his guess was right. But Hermione dismissed it as paranoia. She didn't connect the dots and didn't support her friend. Who knows? Maybe if she had intervened, Malfoy's plan to smuggle Death Eaters into Hogwarts would have failed. Number 5. First impressions. When Hermione first met Harry and Ron, she came across as an arrogant know-it-all. She displayed her knowledge and skills without the slightest hesitation, instantly causing dislike among her future friends. Of course, they later became inseparable, but the start was undeniably rocky, and it was her overconfidence that caused it. Number 6. Gilderoy Lockhart. Like many girls at Hogwarts, Hermione developed a crush on the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, Gilderoy Lockhart. But unlike most of them, she had the intelligence and observational skills to see through a fraud. Yet she didn't. She defended him and was disappointed when the truth came out. This was one of the rare occasions when emotions won over reason. Number 7. Using the time turner. In her 3rd year, Hermione was given a unique artifact, the time turner, so she could attend more classes. The idea seemed brilliant but carried many risks: constant exhaustion, psychological strain, the danger of the secret being discovered, or the artifact being stolen. She didn't even tell Harry or Ron, and in the wrong hands the time turner could have spelled disaster for the entire wizarding world. Number 8. Obliviating her parents. Hermione stood in her parents' living room, wand raised, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Obliviate." In an instant, every memory of their daughter was gone. They believed they were Wendell and Monica Wilkins, a couple preparing to move to Australia. The photographs on the shelves shifted, replacing her image with empty spaces or strangers' faces. It was her way of protecting them from Voldemort's war, but it came at an unbearable cost. She had erased herself from their lives. She told herself it was temporary, that she would restore their memories when it was safe. But the risk was enormous. What if she never returned? What if the magic failed? In the chaos of the Horcrux hunt, there was no guarantee she could undo what she had done. For someone so precise and cautious, Hermione had made a choice built on hope rather than certainty. It was a moment where love and fear overpowered calculation, leaving a wound she carried long after the war ended. Number 9. Freedom on Schedule, her campaign for house elf rights. Hermione's Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare began with noble intentions. She was outraged by the way house elves were treated at Hogwarts and beyond. In her mind, freedom was a gift they deserved, whether they asked for it or not. She knitted hats and socks, leaving them hidden in the Gryffindor common room, hoping elves would pick them up and earn their release. But the plan backfired. The house elves, deeply rooted in a culture of service, saw her gifts as a trick. "They find them insulting," Dobby admitted, explaining that most elves avoided cleaning in areas where Hermione's knitted items were hidden. The result was that Dobby worked twice as hard to cover for them. Hermione had wanted to empower them, but instead she created tension and extra burden for the one elf who actually wanted freedom. Her mistake was not in caring, but in assuming she knew best. She fought for their rights without asking what they wanted, replacing dialogue with her own vision of justice. For someone so sharp in logic, Hermione let emotion and ideology lead the way. And in this case, empathy would have served her cause far better than strategy. Number 10. Confundus at the Quidditch tryouts. The Gryffindor Quidditch tryouts were tense that year. Ron Weasley and Cormac McLaggen were the final two competing for the keeper's position. McLaggen was confident, almost smug, saving shot after shot. Ron was nervous, his hands slick on the broom handle. Hermione Granger stood in the stands, watching every move. When McLaggen prepared for his final save, she quietly flicked her wand and whispered, "Confundo!" McLaggen swerved at the last moment, missing the quaffle completely. "What?" he shouted, looking confused as it sailed past him. The crowd cheered for Ron, who had just secured the position. Ron grinned, unaware of what had just happened. Hermione smiled faintly but said nothing. Her best friend had won, but not fairly. It was a victory crafted by magic, not skill. For someone who valued integrity above all else, it was a strange choice. She had bent the rules, compromising the very fairness she often defended. Yes, she had helped Ron, but at the expense of the team's honesty and her own principles. It was a quiet reminder that even the brightest witch of her age could let loyalty blur the line between right and wrong. Number 11. Harry's Firebolt and the Trust Issue. When Harry Potter unwrapped his new firebolt, it gleamed like a streak of lightning trapped in wood and metal. It was the fastest broom in the world, a gift that made his eyes widen in disbelief. But Hermione Granger didn't share his excitement. Sirius Black was still at large, and no one knew where the broom had come from. To her, it was too perfect and too dangerous. Without speaking to Harry first, Hermione went straight to Professor McGonagall. "I think it should be checked for jinxes," she said firmly. McGonagall agreed, and the firebolt was confiscated. When Harry found out, his face hardened. "You could have told me," he said, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. Ron Weasley backed him up, and for weeks the easy camaraderie between the three of them was gone. Hermione's reasoning had been sound. Dark magic could be hidden anywhere, and a cursed broom could kill in mid-air. But it wasn't just the act that hurt Harry. It was the way it was done. She hadn't asked. She hadn't explained. She had gone behind his back, deciding for him what was safe. That, more than the loss of the broom, was what stung. It was a lesson that cut deep. Even the right decision can cause harm if delivered without trust or empathy. The firebolt was eventually returned, free of curses, but the moment left a scar in their friendship. Hermione's choice protected Harry's life, yet, for a time, it wounded his heart. Number 12. Rita Skeeter, Trap and Blackmail. Rita Skeeter had been circling them like a vulture for months, twisting every word, turning truth into scandal. She had written about Harry's unbalanced state of mind, about Hermione's supposed love triangle with Victor Crumb, all with that poisonous smile. But at the end of the Triwizard Tournament, Hermione found her chance. She discovered Skeeter's secret. The woman was an unregistered animagus, capable of transforming into a beetle. And Hermione caught her, literally, in a jar. It was a quiet act, but the implications were enormous. "You're going to keep your quill to yourself for a whole year," Hermione told her, holding the jar tightly. There was no legal trial, no formal complaint to the Ministry. Instead, Skeeter was trapped by magic, buzzing against the glass. For Hermione, it was a simple choice. Use Skeeter's fear to make her cooperate. It worked. Rita ended up writing the truth about Harry's encounter with Voldemort, printing it in the Quibbler when no one else dared. But the method was darker than Hermione liked to admit. She was holding a person, even one as vile as Rita, against her will. She was threatening to expose her unless Rita obeyed. It was the same sort of leverage Skeeter herself used, only turned against her. The line between justice and revenge blurred in that moment, and Hermione crossed into territory she often condemned in others. The result was undeniable. Harry's side of the story spread across the wizarding world, and people began to question the Ministry's lies. Yet the cost lingered in the air. Hermione had won, but not by the clean, principled fight she always claimed to value. It was a victory wrapped in the same kind of manipulation she had sworn to fight. And that was a truth harder to swallow than anything Rita Skeeter had ever printed. Number 13, disguising as Bellatrix and the Gringotts break-in. Hermione Granger had worn many disguises before, but none as dangerous as this. Under the effects of Polyjuice Potion, she became Bellatrix Lestrange, the most feared witch in Voldemort's inner circle. The plan was bold. Infiltrate Gringotts, slip past the goblins, and steal the Hufflepuff cup from Bellatrix's vault. They had rehearsed the route, the spells, the timing, but no amount of planning could give Hermione the mannerisms of a pureblood fanatic she despised. Her steps were hesitant, her tone unconvincing. "I wish to enter my vault," she said, trying to mimic Bellatrix's drawl, but the goblin's narrow eyes flickered with suspicion. The trouble began almost immediately. Goblins at Gringotts were experts in reading people. Griphook, walking with them, whispered sharp instructions, but Hermione's voice kept shaking. One wrong word, one awkward glance, and the whole plan began to unravel. At the carts leading deep underground, the goblins insisted on identity checks, something none of them had anticipated. Their deception was already hanging by a thread when a dragon's distant roar echoed through the tunnels. Harry's hand twitched toward his wand. Ron shot Hermione a look. They were seconds from disaster. Inside the vault, things only grew worse. The moment Hermione touched the glittering treasures, the Gemino curse struck, multiplying golden goblets until the pile threatened to bury them alive. Harry grabbed the cup, and they scrambled for the exit, but the alarms had already been triggered. "We've been betrayed!" barked a goblin, and within seconds guards were shouting, chains clinking. There was no way back to the surface. Griphook had vanished with the sword of Gryffindor, leaving them stranded among enemies. In the chaos, they made the only choice left, the half-blind dragon chained in the lowest vault. It rose in a frenzy, scattering goblins and breaking through the ceiling in a storm of rubble and smoke. Clinging to the dragon's back, Hermione could barely hear her own thoughts over the roaring wind. The mission had succeeded, but only by a hair's breadth. They had won the Horcrux, but at the cost of Gringotts' trust forever. For Hermione, whose plans were usually airtight, this reckless gamble was unlike her, and all the more dangerous because of it. Number 14. Hitting Gregory Goyle at the dueling club. Chaos was everywhere in the Great Hall that night. Sparks flew across the room as students from different houses faced each other, wands raised, voices shouting incantations. Hermione Granger stood near Harry Potter, eyes scanning the dueling pairs, ready to step in if things got dangerous. It was supposed to be a controlled demonstration, but the controlled part quickly vanished. Professor Lockhart was flapping around, giving useless advice, while Professor Snape looked on with cold satisfaction. The noise, the movement, the tension, it was impossible to keep track of every spell flying through the air. When Hermione saw Gregory Goyle charging toward another student, wand raised, she acted on instinct. "Rictus Empra." The jet of light left her wand faster than she could think, but instead of disarming or distracting him as she intended, the spell hit him square in the chest with far more force than she'd calculated. Goyle stumbled back, his face twisted in shock, before he fell, knocking over two younger students behind him. "Hey, watch it!" someone shouted, but the chaos drowned it out. Hermione's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't the neat, precise spellwork she prided herself on. It was a misfire in the middle of a storm. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, the book describes how the atmosphere in the club spun out of control. Jets of light were flying from all directions. People were dodging and falling over tables, shouting and yelling. In that moment, Hermione's quick thinking had slipped into rash reaction. She didn't check her aim. She didn't consider the crowd. She saw a threat and fired. Even if it was meant to protect, a misdirected spell in such a packed room could have ended much worse. Goyle wasn't seriously hurt, just winded and furious, but the incident left Hermione shaken. She knew spells could misfire, but seeing her own magic hit the wrong person was different. It was a reminder that even the brightest witch of her age could make a mistake when the world around her spun too fast. And in a duel, mistakes didn't just mean embarrassment, they could mean real damage. Number 15, destroying a dragon's tooth in the Deathly Hallows. When Hermione Granger decided to destroy the dragon fang in the chaos of their search for Horcruxes, the decision seemed almost instinctive. In the tense and desperate moments of the hunt, every action carried the weight of life or death, and her priority was always to eliminate any dark magic they encountered before it could be used against them. But the fang she discarded so hastily was no ordinary trophy. It came from the very mouth of a Gringotts dragon, an ancient, chained guardian whose scales and teeth had absorbed centuries of enchantments. A relic like that was more than just a symbol of victory. It was a rare magical instrument, something that could have served as a powerful ally in the battles to come. Yet, in a single, decisive moment, she ensured it would never be used for anything again. The scene had unfolded in the raw aftermath of their narrow escape from the Lestrange vault. They had barely survived the boiling heat of the dragon's breath, the deafening roars, and the disorienting chaos of Gringotts' underground chambers. Every breath they took outside those walls felt like stolen time. Harry was focused on the Horcrux they had just stolen, Helga Hufflepuff's cup, while Ron was reeling from burns on his arms. Hermione, flushed and trembling, examined the deep gash on her bag from where the dragon's tooth had snagged it. With a flick of her wand, she pried the fang free, and without so much as a pause to consider, she cast a silent spell that reduced it to shards and ash. It was quick, clinical, and irreversible. Looking back, the act carried echoes of her earlier decision in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets to use a basilisk fang to destroy Tom Riddle's diary. Then the logic had been clear. Basilisk venom was one of the few substances capable of destroying a Horcrux, and it was a weapon they could not afford to waste. The irony was sharp. Here, in Deathly Hallows, she had in her hands something equally rare, perhaps not identical in properties, but steeped in the kind of ancient magic that could have been harnessed for their cause, yet she dismissed it as though it were nothing but a dangerous remnant to be eradicated. From a magical standpoint, a dragon fang is not just a piece of bone. Centuries-old dragons like the one in Gringotts are infused with layers of protective enchantments, often woven into their very physiology by generations of goblin magic. In Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, dragon parts, especially fangs, are described as highly prized in wand lore, potion making, and artifact construction. Ollivander himself once remarked that certain cores, when combined with dragon elements, could amplify magical stability. In the right hands, a Gringotts dragon fang could have been turned into a tool with unparalleled power, perhaps even something to aid them in detecting or dismantling Horcruxes more efficiently. Hermione's mindset in that moment was undoubtedly shaped by exhaustion and the constant pressure of pursuit. They were fugitives, hunted relentlessly by Death Eaters and the Ministry alike. Any object of magical significance carried the risk of tracking spells, curses, or unforeseen consequences. Her choice to destroy the fang may have been fueled by the desire to remove any potential liability before it could turn into a threat. The problem was that she acted before assessing its true value. In a war where resources were scarce and enemies were armed with ancient magic, such rash disposal was costly. The irony of the situation became more apparent later when they struggled to find effective tools against Horcruxes. They had only the Gryffindor sword and a dwindling supply of basilisk venom from the Chamber of Secrets. Each confrontation with a Horcrux was a delicate operation, and the margin for error was razor-thin. Imagine if they had possessed a dragon fang reworked into a Horcrux-breaking blade or a wand enhancer. It might have spared them from some of the dangers that followed. Ron nearly drowned retrieving the sword from the frozen pond, and Hermione herself suffered deep injuries from cursed objects. A prepared and magically reinforced tool could have altered those risks. Even in the book, small details hint at the significance of what was lost. The dragon was the size of a small hill, its scales pale and worn, its eyes milky with age. This was not a young, wild beast. It was a repository of centuries of magical history. Every tooth, every claw, every breath carried the residue of goblin wards and human countercharms. Destroying a fang from such a creature was akin to burning a library without first checking what knowledge it held. It was the kind of decision that only reveals its gravity when hindsight is the only lens left. From a strategic standpoint, Hermione's choice contrasted sharply with her usual meticulousness. She was the planner, the one who carried the tales of Beedle the Bard in her beaded bag, who hoarded Polyjuice potion for years just in case. For someone so attuned to the long game, this was an uncharacteristic moment of short-term thinking. It's possible the sheer chaos of their escape clouded her judgment, but it also points to a recurring flaw in her battlefield decision-making, her tendency to act decisively before gathering all variables when the stakes felt immediately urgent. One might argue that Hermione, aware of the goblins' hatred for wizards, may have suspected that the fang carried enchantments meant to harm or mislead anyone who tried to use it. Goblin-crafted wards are notoriously tricky, and removing them without triggering curses is a delicate art. However, given her resourcefulness, there was nothing to prevent her from storing the fang safely for later examination. Even if it had been cursed, a careful dismantling by someone like Bill Weasley, an accomplished curse-breaker, could have neutralized the threat while preserving the potential. Number 16. Overtrusting the Ministry of Magic. Hermione Granger's faith in the Ministry of Magic during the early chapters of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire stands out as one of her more questionable judgments, especially in hindsight. At this point in the series, Hermione still saw the Ministry as a reliable authority, a cornerstone of justice and order in the wizarding world. This was not a blind faith in the abstract. It was the belief that the institution itself, with its grand building, dozens of departments and respected officials, was inherently trustworthy. To Hermione, Cornelius Fudge's public role as Minister for Magic symbolized stability, not manipulation. Even when Fred and George whispered about the Ministry's inefficiency, or when Ron cynically remarked about Ministry types looking out for themselves, Hermione brushed off these observations as the kind of baseless complaints teenagers make when faced with adult authority. She preferred to think that the faults of individual officials were exceptions rather than symptoms of a deeper problem. Her attitude is particularly visible during the Quidditch World Cup, when the crisis in the aftermath of the Death Eater attack began to unfold. The Ministry's rapid arrival, with figures like Barty Crouch Sr. barking orders and Ludo Bagman trying to calm the crowd, reinforced her sense that this was a system working to protect citizens. She noticed the chaos, the fear, the accusations, but still interpreted the Ministry's involvement as an example of swift and effective governance. She did not yet question why certain actions seemed targeted at the wrong people, such as the way Winky the house elf was treated. Harry and Ron saw the injustice immediately, recognizing that prejudice and political convenience were driving the accusations. Hermione, while unsettled, still gave the Ministry the benefit of the doubt, convinced that they must have had good reasons that she simply did not yet understand. This overconfidence in the Ministry's fairness made her slow to detect the cracks in the institution's facade. When Rita Skeeter's poisonous articles began appearing in the Daily Prophet, Hermione underestimated how closely the newspaper's editorial slant aligned with the Ministry's goals. She saw Skeeter as an independent nuisance, rather than as part of a larger network of influence that the Ministry quietly encouraged, or at least tolerated. It took much longer for her to grasp that such journalism was a weapon, a subtle way for the Ministry to shape public perception without having to issue official statements. This gap in her understanding was significant because it blinded her to how easily the Ministry could and eventually would manipulate the truth about her friends. Even as Harry was forced into the Triwizard Tournament under suspicious circumstances, Hermione initially leaned toward the idea that official oversight meant safety. The presence of high-ranking Ministry representatives like Barty Crouch Sr. seemed to reassure her. She assumed that the tournament's dangers were well managed because the Ministry was involved. This faith was in direct contrast to Harry's growing unease, especially after he realized he had been entered against his will. Instead of questioning the motives or competence of the Ministry, Hermione focused her skepticism on the students spreading rumors about Harry, not on the adults whose decisions had created the conditions for those rumors in the first place. What makes this trust especially striking is how uncharacteristic it seems when placed against Hermione's other qualities. She was, after all, a girl who challenged professors when she thought they were wrong, who founded SPEW in defiance of Wizarding Society's norms and who constantly questioned the status quo in areas like magical creature rights. But in the matter of the Ministry's authority, she hesitated to apply the same critical thinking. Part of this hesitation likely came from her upbringing. As someone who grew up in the Muggle world, she had learned to respect government institutions as the ultimate arbiters of law. It was easy for her to map that mindset onto the Wizarding world, assuming the Ministry played the same role of impartial protector. The turning point that exposed the fragility of Hermione's belief came with the arrival of Dolores Umbridge at Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix. But the seeds of that shock were sown much earlier in Goblet of Fire, when she dismissed the growing evidence that the Ministry was capable of corruption. She ignored the way Fudge seemed more concerned with his own image than with pursuing the truth about Voldemort's possible return. She overlooked the inconsistencies in Barty Crouch Sr.'s behavior and his harsh treatment of Winky, chalking it up to eccentricity or stress. Hermione's inability to connect these patterns to a systemic issue meant that when Umbridge's authority descended upon Hogwarts, she was unprepared for just how ruthlessly the Ministry could act against those it perceived as threats. Her failure to foresee this is made even clearer by the contrast between her response and Harry's. Harry had already clashed with authority enough to understand that official titles did not always guarantee moral integrity. From his experience with the Dursleys to his encounters with the Ministry during the World Cup, he knew that those in power often acted to protect themselves first. Hermione, on the other hand, clung to the assumption that the Ministry's intervention would be a safeguard. When Harry described Fudge's refusal to believe him about Voldemort's return at the end of Goblet of Fire, she was stunned. Not because she doubted Harry, but because she had to process the idea that the Ministry's leader would deliberately ignore such a danger. Number 17, ignoring Neville Longbottom's help. Neville Longbottom's journey at Hogwarts was one of slow but undeniable transformation, yet his courage was evident long before the rest of the school recognized it. From the moment he stood in front of Harry, Ron and Hermione in their first year, attempting to prevent them from sneaking out, his bravery was written into the story. Still, for Hermione Granger, whose standards for competence were tightly bound to academic skill and quick reasoning, Neville's clumsiness and forgetfulness often overshadowed his virtues. This dynamic became most apparent in situations where help was needed, and Neville's offers were quietly, almost automatically, set aside. It was not malice, it was habit. Hermione was decisive, efficient, and often unwilling to adjust her plans to accommodate someone she thought might slow her down. In their third year, the pattern emerged clearly. When the hunt for Sirius Black's movements took the trio into dangerous territory, Neville offered to accompany them to the library to help research. Hermione, exhausted from juggling time-turner classes and secret excursions, brushed it off. "We've got it handled," she said, in passing, her voice curt, but not unkind. In truth, she was calculating that Neville's presence would require explanations, perhaps mistakes, and certainly more time. The irony was that in those moments, an extra pair of hands and eyes could have provided much-needed relief. Hermione's refusal was not out of cruelty. It was a tactical choice born from her view of who was useful in high-stakes situations. Yet such moments subtly reinforced a hierarchy, one in which Neville's contributions rarely made it past the planning stage. The fourth year brought the Triwizard Tournament, a time when the dangers facing Harry reached unprecedented levels. When Harry was faced with deciphering the clue from the golden egg, Neville's knowledge of magical plants, particularly gillyweed, was a resource waiting to be tapped. Instead, the information came to Harry through Dobby, almost by accident, while Neville remained on the sidelines. The detail is telling. The book states Neville had been reading up on water plants for herbology, but Harry didn't think to ask him. Hermione, who knew better than anyone Neville's growing expertise in herbology, never pushed for his involvement. She was caught in her own whirlwind of strategies, research, and moral debates over the ethics of magical shortcuts. In the process, she overlooked the fact that Neville's skill in that one subject was precisely the edge they needed. The missed opportunities continued in their fifth year, when Dumbledore's army was formed in the Room of Requirement. Neville attended faithfully, throwing himself into every practice session. Hermione took note of his determination, but still, in actual operations outside the safety of the classroom, she defaulted to working in the smaller, more familiar group of herself, Harry and Ron. After Christmas, when Harry had a vision of Sirius in the Department of Mysteries, Neville was among those willing to come to his aid. In the book, Rowling writes, "We're coming too," Neville said determinedly. "We're all in the Order now, aren't we?" It was a moment of raw loyalty. Yet Hermione hesitated before agreeing to take him along, her initial instinct to limit the mission to a tighter circle. Only circumstance forced her hand, and Neville proved, despite injuries, that his courage was as steady as theirs. What Hermione failed to see at the time was that bravery in battle is not only about quick reflexes or a mastery of spells, it is about presence. Neville's presence was a morale anchor. In the chaos of the Department of Mysteries, when spells ricocheted and Death Eaters closed in, Neville, despite a broken nose and a wand that had snapped, still stood his ground. He shielded Ginny, distracted attackers, and followed instructions with unwavering focus. His injuries did not break his spirit, and even as his spells faltered, his refusal to retreat kept the group from crumbling. Yet Hermione's earlier doubts meant that she never truly counted him as part of the core tactical team until much later. The sixth year, shadowed by Dumbledore's impending death, brought even darker challenges. When Death Eaters infiltrated Hogwarts, Neville again placed himself in harm's way. He joined Ginny and Luna in resisting the Carrows' growing cruelty, organizing small acts of defiance. Hermione, away with Harry and Ron hunting Horcruxes, could only hear of his bravery through the stories that trickled to them. This absence forced her to reconsider her earlier judgments. By the time she returned to the castle for the final battle, Neville had already emerged as a leader among the remaining students. "Neville's the one who's been organizing it all," Ginny told her, a statement that must have struck Hermione with both pride and a quiet sting of guilt. The real turning point, however, came during the Battle of Hogwarts. Amid the chaos, Neville volunteered for some of the most dangerous assignments without hesitation. When Harry needed the final Horcrux destroyed, the snake Nagini, it was Neville who stood in the path of Voldemort himself to deliver the fatal blow. This was not the act of the bumbling boy who once forgot passwords or melted cauldrons. This was the act of a man who had been underestimated for years, but had grown into the role of hero without waiting for permission or recognition. Hermione's reaction in those moments was layered: admiration, relief, and the awareness that she had failed time and again to see the full measure of the person standing beside her. The lessons in those years were subtle but sharp. Hermione, whose intellect allowed her to map out complex plans under pressure, had always believed that precision and control were the keys to success. Neville, in her mind, was unpredictable, a variable she could not afford when lives were at stake. Yet war has a way of stripping away illusions. By the end, she could no longer deny that adaptability, steadfastness, and raw courage often outweigh flawless execution. Neville's ability to endure, to rise from defeat without complaint, had been just as valuable as her ability to anticipate problems before they arose. Number 18. Choosing to visit Godric's Hollow at Christmas. The snow in Godric's Hollow lay untouched, a soft white blanket draped over the crooked roofs and ancient gravestones. Lanterns glowed faintly in the windows, their golden light spilling onto empty streets. It was Christmas Eve, and the quiet was absolute, so quiet that the crunch of Harry's and Hermione's boots seemed unnaturally loud. Hermione's breath formed pale clouds in the air as she pulled her cloak tighter, glancing at the church clock that tolled the hour. This was the moment she had insisted on. In her mind, the logic was flawless. Christmas Eve would mean fewer villagers outside, fewer curious eyes, fewer chances for Death Eaters to notice two young strangers slipping through the historic Wizarding Village. She had thought it through, weighed the risks and chosen the date with precision. Yet, in the very silence she had sought, a dangerous flaw hid, waiting to undo them. Hermione had never been one to gamble without reason. She remembered the chill inside the tent when she had first voiced the idea. Godric's Hollow was steeped in significance. It was Harry's birthplace, the resting place of his parents, and the heart of one of the most famous wizarding legends. Voldemort would know this. The Death Eaters would know this. Yet there was also Bathilda Bagshot, the historian who might hold the secret to the Elder Wand. Hermione had argued that the cover of Holiday Stillness would protect them. No one will be watching the streets on Christmas Eve, she had reasoned, flipping through the life and lies of Albus Dumbledore, as if the printed words might reinforce her point. She believed stealth depended on invisibility, and invisibility was easiest when the world was indoors, celebrating. The reasoning seemed airtight, but logic, as events would prove, was fragile when measured against instinct and unpredictability. The village that night felt deserted, not because it was truly empty, but because every movement, every shadow, stood out like ink on snow. Harry and Hermione were not just two figures blending into a crowd, they were the only figures. Even under the disillusionment charm, the emptiness magnified their presence. Their very scarcity became a signal, a flicker in the void, drawing attention to what should have been unnoticed. Hermione had considered the absence of people a shield, but in reality it made them more visible to those who were looking. The moment their feet crossed the threshold into Godric's Hollow, the enchantments surrounding the village seemed to notice them. Harry later thought back to how the snowflakes clung to his cloak in strange patterns, as if tracing their outlines. Somewhere unseen, watchers, magical or human were already narrowing their gaze. Hermione, scanning the churchyard from beneath her hood, did not feel it then. Her focus was on the gravestones, on finding James and Lily Potter's resting place, and perhaps Bathilda's cottage. The emotional weight of the place hung heavy in the frozen air. For Harry, it was the culmination of years of absence. For Hermione, it was a calculated risk. Their plan unravelled in the narrow lane that led to Bathilda Bagshot's home. The crooked houses leaned over the path as though whispering to one another. The smell of frost and chimney smoke lingered in the air, mingled with something faintly metallic. Bathilda's door stood ajar, a dark slit in the pale facade. Hermione's chest tightened. She knew the stories. Bathilda was old, possibly confused, but she had convinced herself the woman could be trusted for one meeting. And yet, as they stepped inside, the silence became oppressive, not comforting. "Bathilda?" Harry called softly, his voice echoing in the dimness. The only reply was the faint rustle of movement from the next room. It was there that Hermione's perfect logic crumbled into horror. Bathilda was not Bathilda, or rather, Bathilda's shell remained, but within it coiled Nagini, Voldemort's serpent. The snake lunged, as the book describes, and Harry saw it coming too late. The decision to come on Christmas Eve had created the perfect trap. No witnesses, no interruptions, no hope of accidental rescue. The deserted streets ensured that when Nagini struck, there would be no sound to carry beyond those thin walls. Every advantage Hermione had imagined became a tool for their enemy. Hermione's instincts in battle were swift, honed by months on the run. She blasted the snake, dragged Harry back, and apparated them out before the venom could reach its mark. But the damage was done. They had been lured into a confrontation they might have avoided on any other day. If the streets had been busier, if there had been a crowd, even the most careful Death Eater might have hesitated to stage such an attack in public view. Hermione had sought invisibility, but in doing so, she had stripped away all potential shields, all accidental safeguards. Harry, shivering in the darkness of their hastily conjured tent, realized the depth of the danger they had narrowly escaped. The invisibility cloak, the disillusionment charm, the muffled footsteps, all useless when the enemy had already anticipated their presence. Hermione, though visibly shaken, replayed her reasoning in her head. She had not miscalculated the facts, but she had underestimated the psychology of the hunt. A predator does not need a crowd to search through when it knows the exact path its prey will take. The Death Eaters did not need to scour the village. They only needed to wait for the night Harry would most likely come. The irony was bitter. Hermione had chosen Christmas Eve to protect Harry, thinking the holiday would keep their enemies complacent. Instead, it had likely confirmed to Voldemort that this would be the night of Harry's pilgrimage. The village's historical and emotional weight made the date almost symbolic, too tempting for Harry to resist, too fitting for an ambush. In the quiet aftermath, she could not ignore the truth. Her cleverness had played directly into the enemy's hands. Even the weather seemed to mock her choice. Snow had muffled their movements, but it also preserved their footprints like ink on parchment. If anyone had wanted to follow, the trail would have been clear and unbroken, a perfect path leading to Bathilda's door. The pale moonlight had illuminated them, glinting on Harry's glasses, turning their breath into visible plumes. In the safety of a crowded Diagon Alley, such details would have been swallowed by noise and motion. Here, each one became a marker. The lesson cut deeper than the physical danger. Hermione had built her strategy on logic alone, dismissing the unpredictable variables that cannot be measured in plans. She had believed that timing was a weapon, that the calendar could be bent to their advantage. But war, she now understood, thrives on exploiting the expected. Voldemort's forces knew their prey well enough to anticipate sentimentality, to weaponize the very memories that would draw Harry to Godric's Hollow. Hermione had outsmarted herself. Harry did not blame her. In truth, he might have gone on that night with or without her approval. But the fact remained. It was her voice that had made the plan concrete, her careful reasoning that had placed them on that snow-covered street. And though they had escaped with their lives, the close call had stripped away some of the certainty she carried like armor. The next time she plotted a move, she would remember the empty lanes of Godric's Hollow and the serpent in the shadows. For the rest of their journey, the memory lingered like a bruise. Hermione's mind returned to the small details she had overlooked, the absence of casual noise, the stillness of the village square, the way every window seemed to watch them. These were not the signs of safety she had taken them for. They were the warning signals of a place too prepared for its visitors, a stage set for a single performance. The book captures the aftermath with quiet finality. They vanished into the night, leaving behind the little village and the snake that had waited there. In those words lay the heart of the miscalculation. Godric's Hollow on Christmas Eve was not a sanctuary, it was a snare. And though Hermione's plan had been born of caution, it was the kind of caution that assumes the world will behave according to reason. In war, and especially in Voldemort's war, reason was only one of many forces at play. Number 19, experimenting with the Firelisk's potion. Hermione Granger had built her entire reputation at Hogwarts on a foundation of preparation, precision, and the avoidance of unnecessary risk. Teachers trusted her judgment, classmates begrudgingly respected her abilities, and even Harry and Ron relied on her to be the one who thought twice before acting. That is why the moment in the Half-Blood Prince when she decided to brew Firelisk potion stood out so sharply. This was not a simple pepper-up potion or a carefully measured batch of polyjuice. Firelisk was a notoriously temperamental brew, advanced enough to be used in any WI-level coursework. The decision seemed to come not from necessity but from a sudden surge of pride, a need to prove herself, perhaps to Professor Slughorn, perhaps to herself. The name alone carried a weight of danger. Firelisk was said to burn as hot as the breath of a basilisk, its fumes capable of scalding skin if brewed incorrectly. In advanced potion-making, there was a clear warning printed in heavy black ink. For accomplished brewers only. Attempting without mastery of Class B heat regulation charms may result in cauldron combustion. Hermione had, of course, read that warning. She had read the entire chapter twice. Yet she still set out her ingredients that afternoon in the potions dungeon with a determination in her eyes that both Harry and Ron recognized immediately. "She's going to prove a point," Ron muttered under his breath, but neither of them expected how quickly the situation would escalate. The classroom itself that day was thick with the smell of stewing ingredients from the other cauldrons. Professor Slughorn had assigned an open brewing session, encouraging students to try potions of their choice from the advanced section. Most groups chose safer tasks, invigoration draughts, wit-sharpening potions, or even mild beautification potions. Hermione, however, arranged a small row of scarlet-scaled Firelisk pepper pods beside her, the key and most volatile ingredient in the recipe. The pods had to be diced within seconds of removal from their containment jar, and each cut released a burst of acrid steam that curled like smoke from dragonfire. She worked quickly, her brow furrowed, her quill with notes from the textbook beside her. In the book, Harry later recalled the scene with unease. Hermione's motions were sharp, precise, but hurried. She was keeping pace with the potion's rapid heating cycle, and the Firelisk recipe required an almost supernatural sense of timing to prevent the concoction from reaching critical instability. Slughorn, occupied in the far corner with Cormac McLagan's oversweetened amortentia, had not noticed the dangerous gleam of orange radiating from Hermione's cauldron. Harry had. He watched as she poured in the final third of powdered salamander bone, the mixture giving off an ominous hiss. The first sign of trouble came when the potion shifted from a molten gold to a searing white. In advanced potion making, that stage was not supposed to appear until the final 30 seconds before cooling, yet Hermione's brew reached it prematurely. She bit her lip, adjusting the flame beneath her cauldron, but the temperature charms she had cast earlier seemed ineffective. The fumes thickened, creeping toward the nearest tables. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple as she leaned in, muttering under her breath, likely recalculating her stirring pattern. But Firelisk was not a potion that forgave even the smallest miscalculation. Across the room, Neville Longbottom, stirring a much safer cure for boils, coughed violently as the sharp heat of the fumes reached him. Lavender brown shielded her face. Ron stood frozen between wanting to help and fearing that touching anything on Hermione's station would make matters worse. The liquid inside the cauldron began to bubble furiously, each pop releasing a flash of light that cast dancing shadows across the dungeon walls. For someone who prided herself on measured control, Hermione was wrestling with a volatile force she could barely contain. It was in that moment that the pride behind her decision became clear. Hermione had spent much of the term bristling at Harry's unexpected success in potions, a success he owed not to sudden brilliance but to the marginal notes of the half-blood prince. She knew it, and it gnawed at her. This was not just an exercise in brewing, it was a challenge to herself to prove she could match, or even surpass, results without any shortcuts. But Firelisk potion was no place for wounded pride. As one steam plume rose high enough to obscure Slughorn's line of sight, the dungeon began to feel more like the mouth of a furnace than a classroom. The near disaster happened quickly. One particularly large bubble burst with a sharp crack, sending a jet of scorching vapour across the aisle. Dean Thomas, leaning over his own cauldron, jerked back just in time to avoid a burn. A faint scorch mark appeared on the wood of his table. Slughorn finally turned, eyes widening, and swept across the room toward Hermione. His wand was already in his hand, ready to cool the brew. But Hermione, flushed and determined, had not yet admitted defeat. She seized the last vial of moonflower extract, meant to stabilize the potion's volatile phase, and tipped it in with a flick. The reaction was immediate. The potion did not cool. It roared. Steam exploded upward, thick and scalding, forcing nearby students to stumble back. Harry threw an arm over his face, feeling the dry, burning heat rush past. Even Slughorn staggered for a second before his counter-charms took hold, forcing the liquid into an instant freeze that crusted the top with a sheet of brittle glass-like frost. The room fell silent except for the faint hiss of cooling metal. Hermione stood perfectly still, her hands still gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles pale. The pride that had pushed her here drained from her face as quickly as the heat left the potion. Her eyes darted toward Dean's scorched table, then toward the group of third years at the far end who had stopped their brewing entirely to stare at her. "A rare but serious miscalculation," Slughorn remarked, his tone half reproach, half relief. In the quiet aftermath, Hermione gave a short nod, her lips pressed thin, saying nothing. That day lodged itself in the memory of her friends for reasons beyond the danger. It was a reminder that even Hermione Granger, the model of meticulous planning, could be swayed by emotion into risking more than was wise. Harry, flipping through his own annotated textbook that evening, thought of the moment when the potion had turned white too soon. She knew better, he reflected privately, but he also knew what had driven her, the need to prove she could stand in the same league as the prince's mysterious potions genius without relying on his scribbles. In hindsight, the incident also hinted at something more subtle, the uncharacteristic willingness Hermione sometimes had to push her boundaries when she felt underestimated. It was not the first time she had taken a risk in pursuit of a point. The Polyjuice incident in their second year had ended with her spending weeks in the hospital wing covered in fur. but even that was done out of necessity for the trio's investigation. Firelisk was different. This was an optional challenge taken under no one's orders, and it had very nearly scorched half the classroom. The Firelisk recipe itself became something of a whispered topic among Gryffindors afterward. The younger students were fascinated that Hermione had attempted it, though most only heard exaggerated versions. That it had blown a hole in the dungeon wall, that Filch had to replace an entire section of flooring, that Madame Pomfrey treated burns for days afterward. In truth, no one was seriously injured, but the scorched mark on Dean's table stayed as a quiet testament to what had happened. Hermione, for her part, never attempted Firelisk again, at least not in school hours. What made this moment resonate in the broader story of Hermione Granger was its humanity. She was brilliant but not infallible, confident but sometimes too eager to prove herself. The lesson was not simply about potion safety, but about understanding one's motives before taking on a dangerous challenge. As Slughorn had once said to another student, "You must know why you're doing what you're doing, my boy, and whether it's worth the cost." Hermione learned that in heat, steam, and the tightening grip of a cauldron handle. Years later, when the three friends remembered their Hogwarts days, Harry would occasionally tease her about the time she nearly turned the dungeon into a sauna. She would roll her eyes, insisting that she had been perfectly in control until the moonflower extract reacted unexpectedly. Yet a faint smile would betray the truth, that she, too, remembered the sharp scent of Firelisk peppers, the blinding steam, and the rare sensation of realizing she had pushed too far, too fast. It was not her proudest moment, but it was one that made her all the more real in the eyes of those who knew her best. Number 20. Underestimating the power of cursed objects. When Harry pulled the heavy locket of Salazar Slytherin from the depths of his pouch and laid it before Hermione, the dim light in the tent seemed to bend toward it. The cursed metal carried a coldness that wasn't simply physical. It radiated unease. They had already seen its strange pull on their thoughts, yet Hermione, ever the strategist, suggested a rotation for wearing it. She believed this system would limit its influence. Her reasoning was calm, deliberate, the kind of practical logic that had saved them countless times before. But this time, her decision underestimated a force that logic could not contain. She trusted in willpower, in the ability to resist through sheer determination. It was a choice born from confidence in her mind, but it would prove to be a dangerous miscalculation. The first days of this arrangement already revealed subtle shifts. The locket seemed to magnify every irritant, every passing thought of suspicion or doubt. Harry noticed it most clearly when Ron wore it. The familiar warmth in his friend's voice dulled into a guarded sharpness. Hermione herself, when the chain pressed against her collarbone, began speaking with an edge that did not belong to her. Yet she dismissed these changes, attributing them to stress, hunger, and the constant tension of their mission. "We can't let ourselves be swayed by fear," she had once said, a conviction lifted straight from the pages of their shared battles. But fear was not the weapon here. It was the corrosion of trust, and the locket was an expert craftsman. J.K. Rowling's text does not leave the reader guessing about the locket's corrosive power. The thing that sat in the pit of the stomach, gnawing its way out, is how the narrative frames Harry's sense of unease when wearing it. It was not just an object, it was a whispering, slow poison designed to turn allies into enemies in their own minds. Hermione, aware of its danger, still believed that the trio's friendship was strong enough to withstand its bite. This is where the brilliance of her mind met the blind spot of overconfidence. She treated the artifact as a logistical problem, something to be managed rather than eradicated, forgetting that some magic was crafted precisely to outlast even the strongest human resolve. The problem grew insidious because the effects were not immediate. A day or two in rotation seemed bearable, even manageable. Harry could endure it, Hermione thought, because she could endure it. But cursed objects, especially those tied to dark wizards of Voldemort's caliber, were never designed for quick ruin. They were designed for attrition. The locket worked like water dripping on stone, wearing away the surface until the structure beneath began to crack. And while Hermione catalogued spells, escape routes, and clues about the Horcrux's destruction, the true battle was already being lost within the walls of their cramped tent. Ron's departure was the breaking point, and it was no coincidence that it came after long days of wearing the locket. His growing paranoia, his cutting remarks about Harry's leadership, and his unfounded doubts about Hermione's loyalty were sharpened to a lethal point by the locket's presence. In those moments, Hermione's earlier decision was laid bare. By choosing a rotation instead of finding a way to isolate the object entirely, she had allowed it to be in constant contact with them, feeding on each of their weaknesses in turn. The night Ron left, his words were heavy with a bitterness foreign to his natural character, and the cursed chain at his neck might as well have been a leash pulling him toward division. Hermione's strength had always been in knowledge, in analyzing threats and finding solutions. Yet the locket revealed that knowledge alone could not counteract a magic designed to prey on the deepest flaws in human nature. She had read about cursed objects in The Dark Arts, a guide to self-protection, and in magical hieroglyphs and logograms, and she knew that some artifacts carried enchantments that resisted even the most advanced counter-curses, but reading about such magic and living under its influence were entirely different battles. Books could warn, but they could not replicate the slow unraveling of one's trust in the people they loved. There is a telling moment when Harry, wearing the locket, feels as though it was closing around his throat, strangling him with every thought. That imagery reflects not only the physical discomfort but also the mental suffocation the Horcrux created. In hindsight, the decision to share that burden equally might seem noble. No one person was meant to suffer alone, but the flaw was in underestimating the nature of the burden itself. By passing it from one to another, they ensured that all would eventually suffer the same erosion of spirit rather than concentrating the damage on one and protecting the others. This was not the first time Hermione's intellectual certainty had led her into dangerous waters. During their second year, she had brewed Polyjuice Potion in a Hogwarts bathroom, a complex and illegal act, confident that she could handle the risks. That experiment left her stuck with cat-like features for weeks. While that was a humorous misstep in retrospect, the Slytherin locket was no laughing matter. This time the cost was not just embarrassment. It was the fracturing of the group's unity at a time when they could least afford it. In war, trust is as valuable as any weapon, and the locket stole it piece by piece. Hermione's reliance on mental discipline is understandable given her history. She had resisted the allure of the time-turner, navigated the dangers of the Department of Mysteries, and faced down Death Eaters without succumbing to panic. She believed, perhaps rightly, that they were stronger together, and that none of them would fall so easily into darkness. But cursed artifacts are built precisely to exploit such beliefs. They slip past the shields of reason and speak directly to insecurities. In Ron's case, it was jealousy and a fear of being overshadowed. In Harry's, the weight of leadership and guilt. In Hermione's, the dread of losing control over their mission. It's worth remembering that Voldemort himself had relied heavily on artifacts to extend his reach. His diary, destroyed in the Chamber of Secrets, had nearly claimed Ginny Weasley's life by preying on her isolation. Dumbledore had warned them indirectly through that example. Cursed objects often had a mind of their own, one designed to latch onto and feed from the thoughts of the bearer. The diary had shown them what prolonged exposure could do. In light of that history, Hermione's decision to keep the locket in constant rotation is even more perplexing. It was as if the lesson from Ginny's ordeal had been set aside in the belief that they, somehow, would fare better. The strain between Harry and Ron, culminating in their explosive argument, was not born entirely from the locket, but it was certainly accelerated by it. Hermione's attempt to mediate between them became more desperate, her voice more brittle. The stress etched lines into her face, and the exhaustion in her eyes told a story she would never put into words. Even she was not immune to the subtle, whispering influence, the quiet amplifications of doubt that the Horcrux planted. And still she clung to the rotation system, as if changing the wearer every few days could somehow outwit the malevolent will embedded in the metal. One of the most striking details in this period is that the locket never allowed its bearer to feel entirely safe. Even when it was not being worn, its presence in the tent was oppressive. Harry once noticed how the air seemed lighter the moment they placed it inside the beaded bag for short intervals. That fleeting relief was a clue to the truth. The only safe distance from such a cursed object was as far as possible. Hermione's system, however, guaranteed proximity. It was like willingly keeping a venomous snake in their camp and taking turns holding it, each person convinced they could resist the bite. After Ron's return and the eventual destruction of the locket with the sword of Gryffindor, the relief was instantaneous and profound. The object's grip shattered, and with it, the fog over their minds lifted. Looking back, Hermione never openly admitted her error, but the shadow of that decision lingered. The cost of underestimating the locket was etched into their journey. A reminder that even the cleverest witch of her age could misjudge the subtle, patient malice of dark magic. It was a hard truth. Intellect is a shield, but not an impenetrable one. The cursed locket stands as one of the clearest examples in their story of how dangerous it is to treat dark magic as a problem of endurance. Hermione's choice, born from a mix of pragmatism and faith in her friend's resilience, nearly pulled them apart. It is an uncomfortable lesson, but a necessary one. Some battles cannot be won by sharing the load, they can only be survived by removing the source entirely. And in the frozen nights of their long hunt, that lesson came at the price of their unity. Number 21, Public Argument with Lavender Brown. Hermione Granger had built her reputation at Hogwarts on intellect, discipline, and an ability to rise above the petty distractions that seemed to consume many of her peers. Yet in the winter of her 6th year, her carefully cultivated image took an unexpected dent. It happened during a moment when emotions ran high, and she chose a path that was far from her usual calculated restraint. Lavender Brown, a girl known for her chatter and unabashed displays of affection, had begun dating Ron Weasley. The sight of Ron and Lavender together seemed to ignite something in Hermione, something sharper and less controlled than her usual composure. What began as quiet disapproval soon escalated into thinly veiled barbs, delivered in the company of other students, where every glance and whispered laugh could be interpreted as victory or defeat. The tension between Hermione and Lavender was palpable in the Gryffindor common room. It wasn't that Lavender had done anything truly cruel to Hermione. Rather, it was the very public nature of her relationship with Ron, her hand always in his, her voice loud and bright when she called him One, that seemed to needle Hermione in a way she could not hide. "It looks like he's never been happier," Hermione once remarked in a tone that managed to carry both sarcasm and bitterness, even though her words were spoken under the pretense of casual observation. It was a rare lapse for Hermione, who usually prided herself on the precision of her speech. This sharpness reached a peak one evening in the common room when Lavender was showing Parvati Patil a small paper heart she had folded for Ron. The gesture was ridiculous, yes, but it was harmless. Yet Hermione, sitting with a book open but unread, made a cutting comment about how some people seemed to have far too much time to waste. Parvati's eyes widened, Lavender stiffened, and a ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the room. In that instant, Hermione had claimed a small and fleeting sense of superiority, but it came at the cost of dignity. The moment did not go unnoticed by Harry, who glanced at her with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. From the outside, it was clear that Hermione's words were not winning her any quiet victories. Ron, far from feeling drawn back to her, appeared even more determined to cling to Lavender, as if to prove that his relationship was worth defending. Hermione's reaction, rather than making him reconsider, seemed to confirm his suspicion that she was jealous. It was one of those subtle but dangerous dynamics. The more she bristled, the more he dug in. In a way, her sharp remarks became fuel for the very fire she wished would burn out. What made the situation more curious was Hermione's usual ability to remain silent when it suited her. She could sit through a class with Professor Snape, absorbing his unjust criticisms, and respond only when called upon. She could endure Draco Malfoy's sneers without letting him see that they had struck home. Yet with Lavender she seemed incapable of ignoring the provocations, if they could even be called that. Lavender was not an enemy in the traditional sense. She was simply the girl Ron had chosen for reasons perhaps only he understood. The book describes one of Hermione's moments of visible restraint cracking. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, after seeing Ron and Lavender together, Hermione stormed away, her broomstick over her shoulder, muttering furiously under her breath. That muttering, in a place like Hogwarts, was almost an invitation for others to speculate. A mutter is not silence. It is an audible clue to what lies beneath the surface, and Hermione, for all her intelligence, must have known that others would hear, guess, and pass judgment. In the tight-knit environment of Gryffindor Tower, whispers and smirks spread quickly. Every time Hermione's voice sharpened in Lavender's presence, it was another note in a growing chorus of rumours. Even the first-year students could read the tension. It wasn't that Hermione was wrong to feel hurt. Jealousy is as human as any other emotion. But she allowed those emotions to dictate her public demeanour, something she had always warned others against. She had once chided Harry for letting his temper show in front of Professor Umbridge, reminding him that you should learn to control your temper. Yet here she was, unable to follow her own advice. The irony was that Hermione, had she chosen to ignore Lavender, might have gained the quiet upper hand. There is a certain power in appearing unbothered, in letting the other party's actions play out without visible reaction. Lavender's flamboyant affection might have looked shallow if contrasted with Hermione's quiet dignity. Instead, Hermione's visible irritation gave Lavender something to react to, something to push against. Lavender may have sensed that her relationship with Ron provoked Hermione, and that knowledge could only have encouraged her to display it all the more. One afternoon in the library, Hermione's restraint faltered yet again. Lavender was there, giggling with Parvati over a book of love charms. Hermione, passing by with an armful of Transfiguration texts, made a loud comment about the intellectual bankruptcy of people who think Amatentius smells like perfume. It was a remark layered with implication, and though Lavender didn't answer, her flushed face told everyone that she understood exactly what Hermione meant. That moment, like so many others, reinforced the divide between them, not just personally, but in the eyes of everyone who witnessed it. Ron, for his part, seemed alternately oblivious and defensive. His relationship with Lavender was hardly deep or stable, but he clung to it in the face of Hermione's disapproval. If Hermione had remained silent, Ron might have grown bored sooner. Instead, her comments kept the situation charged. The more public the tension became, the more it seemed like a challenge to his pride. And Ron Weasley, for all his easygoing nature, did not enjoy losing challenges. The heart of the problem was that Hermione's remarks did not simply reveal jealousy, they undermined her own self-image. She was supposed to be above such things, the girl who valued wit over flirtation, scholarship over spectacle. But in these moments, she resembled any other hurt teenager lashing out. That might have made her relatable to some, but it did little to help her cause with Ron. The reality was that her sharpness did not pull him toward her, it pushed him further away. It is worth noting that this was not a single incident, but a pattern that unfolded over weeks. Each sarcastic quip, each cutting remark layered one upon another until they became part of the background noise of Gryffindor life. What could have been dismissed as an isolated lapse instead became a narrative: Hermione versus Lavender. And narratives, once established, are difficult to dismantle. They grow beyond the control of the people involved. The contrast between Hermione's behavior here and her usual mastery of discretion was stark. In matters of schoolwork or even politics, she could strategize like a seasoned diplomat. She could sit on dangerous knowledge, like the existence of the Time Turner in her 3rd year, without betraying anything to those around her. But when it came to personal relationships, particularly where her feelings for Ron were concerned, she seemed unable to apply the same discipline. It was as if the logical part of her mind went dark, leaving only the emotional responses of a wounded friend and would-be partner. From a broader perspective, Hermione's actions are a reminder that even the most composed individuals can stumble when emotions run high. Her intelligence did not shield her from the temptation to have the last word, to puncture Lavender's confidence in front of others. Yet the victory of a well-placed barb is fleeting, and in the days that followed each incident, she had to live with the lingering impression it left. Those moments did not make her look strong. They made her look vulnerable in a way she had not intended. In the end, the romance between Ron and Lavender did not last, and perhaps it was always destined to fade. But Hermione's public reaction to it left a mark of its own. Instead of letting the relationship run its course while she stood unshaken, she let her emotions dictate her behavior in the most visible of settings. It was a choice that did not serve her as well as silence might have. Sometimes the cleverest response is not a clever remark at all, but the refusal to give the other person any evidence that they have touched a nerve. Hermione, in those weeks, learned this the hard way, though whether she would admit it, even to herself, is another matter entirely. Number 22, neglecting magical creatures in the forest. In the bleak, tense months of hiding described in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the forest became both a prison and a shield for Harry and Hermione. It was during these months, when every sound in the undergrowth could mean discovery or death, that Hermione Granger made a series of choices that, while sensible on the surface, held deeper consequences. The most striking example was her deliberate avoidance of any contact with the magical creatures whose domains they wandered through. The snow-laden clearings and shadowed thickets often bore signs of life, not just foxes or owls, but the unmistakable traces of beings who walked on the boundary between human politics and ancient magic. And yet Hermione, with her cautious nature and determination to keep their circle as small as possible, dismissed them. It was a decision born of fear and strategy, but one that quietly closed doors before they could even be knocked upon. There was one moment described in a few brief lines in the book that could have altered the course of their isolation. After apparating into a stretch of dense woodland, Harry noticed a set of deep, hoof-shaped impressions in the frost-covered soil. They were far too large for any deer and far too symmetrical to be accidental. Harry, who had seen these before during Umbridge's detentions in his 5th year, recognized them instantly as the tracks of centaurs. The air itself seemed charged, as though an unseen observer lingered beyond the trees. He turned to Hermione, pointing them out, but Hermione's reaction was swift and firm. She simply urged him to keep walking, muttering that we can't risk it, and steering him back toward the cover of thicker brush. In that moment, the chance for an unexpected alliance dissolved into the cold morning air. Hermione's choice was not without logic. By this stage, they were fugitives hunted by Death Eaters, with Voldemort's forces stretching their influence into every corner of the magical world. To trust anyone, even creatures not aligned with wizards, was to risk capture. Yet there is a difference between caution and preemptive dismissal, and Hermione's mind was locked in a pattern of filtering the world into safe and unsafe at the first glance. The centaurs, she reasoned, had little interest in wizarding affairs and could just as easily turn them away as offer aid. But the flaw in her logic was that the centaurs of the Forbidden Forest had already taken sides before, and they had sided against Voldemort's followers when the forest was threatened. Firenze, exiled for his cooperation with Dumbledore, had shown that they were not as indifferent as legend suggested. The tracks they ignored were fresh. The sharp edges of the hoof prints, unblurred by wind or snow, suggested that the centaurs had passed only minutes earlier. A faint smell of smoke, carried by the wind, hinted at a camp not far off. In hindsight, these signs could have been the opening of a negotiation, a chance to explain their mission, to appeal to the centaurs' fierce independence and their resentment of the Death Eaters' intrusion into their territory. But instead the moment was swallowed by silence. Hermione led them deeper into obscurity, away from paths and away from possible friends. Hermione's fear of unpredictable reactions was amplified by her memories of her own strained encounters with magical beings in the past. She remembered Hagrid's stubbornness when it came to trusting creatures others considered dangerous, and how often that faith had nearly backfired. Acromantulas, Thestrals, even Buckbeak had all taught her that contact with non-human magical beings carried risks she could not afford while they were carrying the Horcrux and living on the edge of starvation. In her mind, each step toward a creature was a step toward losing control of their safety. But her rigid caution also meant she was blind to the nuances of the moment. The centaurs were not hostile predators. They were proud, territorial, and deeply connected to the balance of their land. Harry, though frustrated, did not press the matter. The weight of the locket around his neck dulled his own urge to seek allies, and he let her decision stand. But he could not shake the memory of Firenze's words from years before. "The war is coming to the forest as well, Harry Potter." That prophecy had been fulfilled. The centaurs would inevitably be drawn into the conflict whether they wished it or not. And in those bleak days of wandering, even a single extra ally could have meant food, shelter, or information about Death Eater movements. Hermione's dismissal had not just kept them safe in the immediate moment. It had also denied them the ripples of influence that might have followed an alliance. The irony is that Hermione herself had once been an advocate for magical creatures, campaigning for their rights through SPEW, and challenging the wizarding world's casual prejudices. Yet here, faced with a chance to bridge the gap with another marginalized group, she withdrew into mistrust. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of their journey, the constant grind of moving camp and rationing food, that dulled her old instincts. Or perhaps it was the psychological narrowing that comes with prolonged danger, the human tendency to see every unknown as a threat, even when help is desperately needed. Whatever the cause, her own principles bent under the weight of survival. Later, as they moved on through the forest, small details hinted at what they had left behind. A glint of arrowhead embedded in a tree trunk, a circle of flattened grass where something large had slept, even a faint, rhythmic drumming sound on the wind that might have been hooves retreating deeper into the woods. Hermione ignored them all, pushing forward with a determination that brooked no debate. For her, the mission's secrecy outweighed every other priority. But in doing so, she had shut out the forest's living inhabitants, many of whom were no friends of Voldemort's growing empire. The forest in Rowling's world is not a neutral space. It is alive with histories and grudges, loyalties and prophecies that run parallel to human affairs. The centaurs, unlike the goblins or house elves, hold themselves apart from wizarding politics. Yet when the equilibrium of their home is threatened, they act decisively. The Death Eaters' encroachment into the Forbidden Forest during the Battle of Hogwarts proved that their patience had limits. This makes Hermione's decision all the more curious because she, of all people, understood the symbolic power of shared enemies. In a war fought on multiple fronts, even a single conversation could tilt a balance. The choice to avoid the centaurs also revealed the unspoken tension between Harry and Hermione during those months. Harry, increasingly guided by intuition and flashes of instinct, often noticed things in their environment that Hermione filtered out. She, meanwhile, trusted methodical caution over gut feelings. When he slowed to examine the tracks, she saw only a delay that might expose them to danger. It was a fundamental difference in how they perceived the world, Harry scanning for opportunities in the chaos, Hermione narrowing her focus to eliminate risk. Both approaches had merit, but in this instance, hers shut down a possibility before it could be tested. Rowling's text does not linger on the moment, but it is precisely these fleeting decisions that shape the course of a journey. The reader is left to wonder what might have been exchanged in a meeting with the centaurs. Perhaps they could have shared intelligence on the Snatchers' patrol routes. Perhaps they could have given shelter in a hidden glade away from human eyes, or perhaps they would have refused any involvement at all. But the point is that the possibility itself was erased, not by external threat, but by internal caution. As days bled into nights, the forest became a map of what-ifs. Hermione's decision became one of many small, quiet choices that defined the limits of their campaign. She was not wrong to be wary. The centaurs could be unpredictable, even hostile if approached without respect. But the cost of total avoidance is that the world shrinks to the size of one's fears. In this way, Hermione's policy of preemptive disengagement mirrors a broader truth in war, that safety bought at the expense of connection can leave one isolated at the moment when allies are most needed. One cannot ignore the bitter symmetry between this and the later events at Hogwarts, when the centaurs did, in fact, join the fight against Voldemort's forces. They emerged from the forest, bows drawn, to strike at the Death Eaters in the castle grounds. That alliance came without negotiation, driven by the invasion of their home. But one wonders if an earlier meeting might have brought them into the resistance sooner, when Harry and Hermione were most desperate for help. The tracks in the frost were an unopened door, and once passed by, it could never be reopened in the same way. In the grand narrative of the Deathly Hallows, the overlooked moment with the centaur tracks is easy to miss. Yet it serves as a quiet illustration of how fear shapes decision-making in war. Hermione's choice preserved their immediate safety, but at the potential cost of long-term advantage. It is a moment that asks the reader to weigh the value of caution against the power of trust, and to see that sometimes the most dangerous path is the one where no risks are taken at all. Number 23. Reading secret magic at the wrong time. The night in the forest was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against the skin and made every rustle sound like a threat. The three of them, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, had set up their makeshift camp near the edge of a clearing, using the tent from the Quidditch World Cup, its protective charms barely holding against the damp chill. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, making the shadows stretch and distort under the flickering light of their small, enchanted fire. Harry was checking the perimeter charms for the third time, Ron sat cleaning his wand with a ragged sleeve, and Hermione... She was sitting cross-legged, hunched over a thick, cracked leather tome. The gold lettering on its spine read, Arcana Obscura, Rituals and Forgotten Spells. The book's cover was worn smooth, and its edges smelled faintly of age and dust, as though it had been hidden in a library vault for centuries. Her lips moved silently as her eyes devoured the cramped, curling script, oblivious to the fact that her turn to watch the camp had begun half an hour earlier. It wasn't just any book, it was a treasure of forgotten knowledge, a find that could have easily been in the restricted section at Hogwarts. Hermione had retrieved it from the ruins of Bathilda Bagshot's home in Godric's Hollow, hidden inside a false panel in the study. Pages described enchantments so ancient that even Dumbledore might have paused before attempting them. There were diagrams of runes that seemed to shimmer faintly when looked at from the corner of the eye. One section spoke of binding wards older than the founding of the school, and hexes woven into the fabric of the earth. To Hermione, the risk of leaving the book unread felt greater than any danger outside their camp. She kept flipping pages, her fingers lingering over a chapter titled Concealment Through Shadowbinding. In the quiet, her heartbeat seemed to match the rhythm of the turning pages. But the problem with shadowbinding, Harry would later recall, was that shadows had to be watched, and no one was watching them now. Ron glanced toward Hermione a couple of times, muttering under his breath, but said nothing. They all knew Hermione's habit of disappearing into the world of her books, the way her focus narrowed to a pinprick until everything else dissolved. Normally, it was an advantage. Normally, her deep dives into ancient magic saved their lives, but that night the forest was not normal. The air had a strange metallic tang, like a storm brewing without wind, and the mist curled unnaturally around their ankles. Harry, returning from his rounds, noticed a faint shimmer above the clearing, like moonlight caught in invisible threads. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the shimmer deepened into the shape of a sphere, pulsing faintly in the dark. He recognized it instantly from Mad-Eye Moody's old warnings, a magical tracker, the kind Death Eaters used to pinpoint magical signatures in an area. If you ever see the air move without wind, Moody had once told him, assume you've been marked. Harry's pulse quickened. He called Ron's name sharply, but Hermione didn't stir. She was still bent over her book, now tracing a set of curling runes with her wand tip, muttering the words under her breath. In later retellings, Ron would describe the moment with clenched teeth. We nearly had a pack of them on us because she was reading. The tracker flared, a web of light invisible to muggles but clear as day to a wizard's eye, stretching tendrils outward, searching for movement. Harry and Ron scrambled to reinforce the perimeter charms, layering protective spells like desperate patchwork. They had seconds, maybe less, before the signal reached its master. Hermione only looked up when Harry's wand arm brushed her shoulder, his face pale and furious. The words on the page had been so compelling, descriptions of siphoning the moon's reflection to mask one's presence and threading shadow into silence, that the concept of time had vanished. The irony struck Harry later. The very page Hermione had been studying could have concealed them entirely if she'd had the chance to try it. But knowledge without timing was a luxury they couldn't afford. In war, every second spent learning was a second not watching, and in that second, the enemy only needed one opportunity. They managed to collapse the camp within minutes, stuffing their meager supplies into the beaded bag. The air shimmered again, this time from a different angle, and a faint crack echoed in the distance. Apparition, too close for comfort. The forest swallowed their footprints as they fled, Harry gripping the invisibility cloak in one hand, Ron clutching Hermione's arm to keep her moving. Hermione later tried to justify herself, her voice tight. If we'd had time to cast the shadow binding, they wouldn't have found us at all. But Harry didn't reply. He remembered too clearly the way the shimmer had spread like frost over the treetops, the way the mist had shifted as though holding its breath. He thought about how even the best spells were useless if you didn't see the danger in time. The most dangerous magic, Dumbledore had once said, is the magic that distracts you from the danger already at your feet. That night, Hermione's decision had almost proved the truth of those words. There was another layer to the mistake, one Harry understood later, when they had a moment's safety. The Arcana Obscura was not an easy read. It was riddled with archaic phrasing, and its spells often required obscure components. One such incantation, which Hermione had been dissecting that night, mentioned the Watcher's absence as a precondition for the magic to work. Absence. It was almost prophetic. By burying herself in the book, she had fulfilled the very condition that left them vulnerable. She had not been the Watcher. And in that absence, the Death Eaters had almost found their opening. The forest taught its own lessons, often harsher than any classroom. Hermione's brilliance had never been in question. Her ability to pass ancient magical theory rivaled even the professor's. But that brilliance carried a flaw, the belief that the acquisition of knowledge was always the priority. In Hogwarts, that belief had rewarded her. In the forest, it could kill them. Ron, still pale from the narrow escape, had muttered something about books being as dangerous as curses. Hermione didn't argue, though she clutched the Arcana Obscura tighter than ever, as if determined not to let it go. The Death Eaters did not find them that night, but they came close enough for Harry to hear the distant pop of apparition and the faint crackle of cursed fire burning somewhere behind them. The mist thickened as they moved deeper into the trees, and every step felt like a countdown. Later, by the faint glow of a shielded lumos, Hermione went back to the same page in the book, eyes scanning as if the near disaster hadn't happened. She whispered the spell's name, Umbra Vinculum, and Harry realized she was memorizing it for later. The urgency in her voice was not just about the spell's usefulness. It was the urgency of someone who could not accept that knowledge had come at the wrong time. Harry understood. In the war they were fighting, every tool mattered, but he also knew that the Arcana Obscura was a double-edged wand. It demanded attention, the kind that left the reader deaf to the world. And in the world they now occupied, silence could be fatal. The tracker spell had been a reminder that enemies were not waiting politely for them to be ready. Hermione's decision that night had been born of good intentions, arming herself with the means to protect them, but intentions meant little when weighed against the timing of danger. When Harry thought back on it later, what haunted him most was not the flare of the tracker or the hurried flight through the trees, but the image of Hermione in the firelight, the book's gold-leafed letters glowing like embers. Her face had been lit with the kind of focus that could crack ancient riddles, but also the kind that could blind her to the shifting shadows just beyond the camp. He thought of Moody's warning again. Keep one eye on the threat and the other on the road ahead, or you won't live to use the spell you're learning. That night, they had come dangerously close to proving the lesson in the worst possible way. It was a sobering truth in their journey. Knowledge was power, yes, but in the wrong moment it was also peril. The Arcana Obscura remained in Hermione's bag, wrapped in cloth to protect its fragile spine, but after that night she never opened it while on watch again. She would still read it, of course. Hermione was incapable of leaving such a book untouched, but only when Harry or Ron took the guard shift. They didn't speak about the incident often. It hung between them like the mist in the forest, a reminder that even the brightest witch of her age could make a choice that skirted the edge of disaster. And in the darkness of that war, the edge was closer than any of them wanted to admit. Number 24, giving Harry a broken wand in the Chamber of Secrets. Hermione Granger was known at Hogwarts for her meticulous attention to detail, a student whose preparation for any magical task bordered on perfectionism. In class, she checked her parchment twice before turning it in, reread every instruction before brewing a potion, and never, under any circumstance, used a spell without being absolutely certain of its effects. That is precisely why her small but critical lapse in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets stands out so sharply. During the desperate chase to save Ginny Weasley from the depths of the chamber, Hermione unwittingly placed Harry in significant danger by handing him Ron's badly damaged wand, a wand whose dangerous behavior had already been witnessed throughout the year. It was an uncharacteristic and perilous decision that could have had catastrophic consequences in such a tense moment. The state of Ron's wand was no secret. Early in their second year, after Ron and Harry crashed the flying Ford Anglia into the Whomping Willow, the wand had taken the brunt of the damage. The book describes how it had snapped nearly in two. The phoenix feather core was nearly poking out. From that point forward, any attempt to use the wand resulted in unpredictable magical backlash. Ron's Eat Slugs hex had turned on him in the most revolting way possible. Charms backfired, transfigurations failed, and the wand had a disturbing habit of sparking or exploding at the worst possible moment. This wasn't a matter of hidden danger. The entire Gryffindor common room knew that wand was trouble. Hermione herself had been present for many of these incidents. She had watched Ron cough up slugs for hours after his jinx went wrong. She had been at the same Quidditch match where the wand spat green smoke instead of performing a proper cheering charm. Her intellect would not have allowed her to forget the visual of that cracked wood, the fraying core, and the ominous snapping sound it made under stress. This is why her decision, in the chaos of the chamber rescue, feels so unlike her. She, the logical thinker, the cautious planner, did not stop to ensure that Harry had a safe and reliable magical tool before confronting one of the most dangerous situations they had ever faced. The incident becomes more striking when you consider the stakes. The Chamber of Secrets was not simply another Hogwarts corridor. It was an ancient and deadly lair, home to the legendary basilisk. Every moment counted, every spell might be the difference between survival and death. Harry, without a functioning wand, was essentially defenseless against magical threats, yet in the haste to equip him, Hermione gave him the one object she should have recognized as a liability. It's as if, in the middle of a raging fire, someone handed a firefighter a hose full of holes, not out of malice, but out of thoughtless urgency. What makes this lapse more fascinating is that Hermione's character arc is defined by her avoidance of such mistakes. In the first book, she famously reminded Harry and Ron, "We could have been killed, or worse, expelled." She was the voice of caution. In the third book, she used a time-turner with precise care, understanding the risks of even the smallest deviation. She was the one who checked and rechecked spells, corrected pronunciation, and read ahead. Yet here, in the second book, under the weight of fear and urgency, we see a glimpse of how even Hermione could let instinct override preparation. Some might argue that Hermione's choice was excusable, that in the midst of panic, one cannot be expected to assess every detail. But in truth, this was not just a split-second decision. She had months of first-hand experience with the wand's behavior. She knew it had a tendency to explode in sparks, shoot random jets of smoke, and produce the exact opposite of the intended result. The memory of Lockhart's ill-fated attempt to fix Harry's broken arm, which ended with him removing all the bones entirely, should have been fresh in her mind as a reminder of how dangerous magical mishaps could be. To hand Harry such a volatile object was to risk history repeating itself at the worst possible time. Rowling's own description of Ron's wand earlier in the book makes the danger vivid. Ron's wand had snapped almost in two. It kept backfiring at the slightest touch. This was not subtle foreshadowing, but an outright warning. If anything, the repeated backfires served as a narrative alarm bell that attentive characters, especially Hermione, should have heeded. The storytelling irony is that the reader, well aware of the wand's defects, cannot help but feel a spike of anxiety at the thought of it being used in the climax of the story. It is important to remember that in that underground confrontation, Harry's survival depended not only on courage, but on the tools at his disposal. Against the basilisk, spells might have been necessary to shield himself, summon help, or distract the creature. Against Tom Riddle, whose magic was fully functional, a malfunctioning wand was a ticking time bomb in Harry's own hand. That Hermione, so often the strategist, overlooked this reality suggests that her logical mind was clouded by the emotional storm of knowing Ginny's life was in danger. From a character analysis perspective, this moment reveals something vital about Hermione. Even the most rational individuals are susceptible to mistakes when the people they care about are at risk. Her decision was not born of negligence but of desperation. The urgency of getting Harry armed overshadowed the careful calculation she normally applied. In that way, it is a deeply human moment, showing that Hermione's intellect does not make her immune to the impulsive choices driven by loyalty and fear. Still, the hypothetical consequences of this choice are chilling. Imagine if, in that final confrontation, Harry had tried to cast a defensive charm, only for the wand to explode in his hand. The resulting delay or injury could have allowed the basilisk to strike. Without Fawkes's timely intervention or the sword of Gryffindor, the outcome could have been fatally different. The broken wand wasn't merely a symbolic flaw, it was a tangible threat, and by passing it to Harry, Hermione unknowingly amplified the danger of an already life-threatening mission. One cannot overlook the subtle narrative tension this created. The reader, aware of the wand's history, enters the chamber scene with an extra layer of dread. It's not only the basilisk or Tom Riddle that poses a danger, but the very object in Harry's grip. That sense of layered peril is part of what makes the Chamber of Secrets such a tense installment in the series. It's not just the external threats, it's the lurking, familiar hazards that could turn on the heroes at any second. Interestingly, this lapse is rarely discussed in fan circles with the same intensity as other questionable decisions in the series. Perhaps because Hermione's reputation for competence is so well established, readers unconsciously smooth over the inconsistency. Yet in a story so attentive to magical cause and effect, this oversight stands out like a hairline crack in otherwise flawless glass. It does not shatter her character, but it certainly refracts it in a new light. Even Hermione herself might later reflect on this with discomfort. Knowing her, the memory of that rushed handoff would trouble her. She would replay it, think of the alternative. What if she had paused to check, or even used her own wand to assist Harry instead? Her self-critical nature would not allow her to dismiss the error entirely. And perhaps in her own private thoughts, she would acknowledge that in that moment she let her emotions outrun her reason. This rare mistake serves as a subtle reminder to readers that no character, no matter how gifted, is beyond error. It enriches Hermione's arc by showing that her perfectionism has limits, that her logical exterior hides a heart willing to take risks for her friends, even if those risks defy her usual caution. In the same way that Ron's loyalty sometimes blinds him to danger, Hermione's need to act in a crisis can lead her to leap before she looks. It is not a flaw that undermines her. It is one that makes her real. Ultimately, the broken wand in Harry's hand during the chamber rescue is more than a plot detail. It is a symbol of the thin line between preparation and impulse, between the safety of calculated choices and the peril of desperate action. Hermione crossed that line in a heartbeat, and though fortune spared her the worst consequences, the moment remains a quiet but potent example of how even the brightest witch of her age could stumble when the stakes were personal. In the dangerous world of magic, even one such stumble could change everything. Number 25. Distrusting Luna Lovegood. When the group first met Luna Lovegood on the Hogwarts Express in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, she was sitting serenely in a compartment reading The Quibbler upside down, wearing butterbeer corks as a necklace. To most students, it was an immediate signal that she was not someone to be taken seriously. Hermione Granger, always anchored in logic and grounded in the tangible, seemed to categorize Luna instantly as whimsical at best, delusional at worst. Yet Luna's unconventional perspective was not without its merits. She had the rare ability to notice things others dismissed, and her own insight would later prove critical in situations that required more than textbook intelligence. There came a moment in their 5th year when Luna's intuition brushed dangerously close to being a life-saving warning. During the chaos following Harry's vision of Sirius in the Department of Mysteries, the group, Harry, Hermione, Ron, Ginny, Neville, and Luna, found themselves navigating uncertain territory. On their way to the Thestral paddock, Luna had slowed, her pale eyes darting to the shadows beyond the path. She spoke quietly, noting that she thought she had seen cloaked figures moving against the tree line. "They're not moving like centaurs," she murmured, almost to herself. But Hermione, focused on organizing their departure and skeptical of any claims that could not be rationally verified, waved it off as an overactive imagination. Hermione's reasoning was consistent with her character. She valued verifiable facts, concrete evidence, and logical deduction above all else. To her, Luna's world of crumple-horned snorkacs and rackspurts was a charming distraction from reality. Nothing more. "Luna," she said briskly at the time, "there's no one there. You're letting your mind play tricks." Her confidence, however, blinded her to the fact that Luna had been right before, even when her words were wrapped in peculiar phrasing. The encounter in the Forbidden Forest during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries could have begun very differently had Hermione paused to consider that unusual sources can still produce truths. The figures Luna had glimpsed were, in fact, Death Eaters moving under the concealment of disillusionment charms. They had been tracking the group from the moment they left the castle, planning to intercept them before they reached the Thestrals. The only reason their ambush failed was because Harry, moving slightly ahead, stumbled upon an odd shimmer in the air, the faint outline of a figure that moved when he moved. His instinctive jinx startled the hidden Death Eater, forcing them into the open. But it was dangerously close. Had the Death Eaters reached them unseen, the group could have been overpowered before even leaving the Hogwarts grounds. This was not the first instance where Hermione's dismissal of Luna's perspective risked missing crucial information. Earlier in the year, during the search for ways to resist the Ministry's interference, Luna had suggested that unusual creatures in the forest seemed restless, as though they're expecting trouble. Hermione had laughed softly, explaining that animal behavior was not a reliable predictor of magical events. Yet in retrospect, the forest's tension had coincided with the clandestine movements of Umbridge's inquisitorial squad and the growing presence of Ministry spies near the school. Luna's observations, while not expressed in the language of aura reports, often contained a kernel of truth. The tension between Hermione's grounded logic and Luna's instinctive awareness was more than just a clash of personalities. It was a reflection of the larger theme in their world, the danger of discounting information simply because it does not arrive in the expected form. Hermione's approach saved them countless times, from brewing Polyjuice Potion in their second year to unraveling the mystery of the basilisk. Her skepticism was a strength, but here it turned into a blind spot. Luna's method was not to prove a theory step by step, but to sense patterns and undercurrents that escaped others' attention. When Harry later recalled that near ambush, he remembered Luna's earlier words and felt a pang of guilt. He knew that Luna had seen something he had not, and he wondered how often they had ignored her, because she spoke in the language of Nargles instead of certainties. Luna had told them once, after being questioned about her beliefs, "You're just as sane as I am," and the truth in that statement was sharper than it appeared. Sanity, after all, is not defined by conformity to the majority's vision, but by the ability to navigate reality, and Luna navigated hers with a kind of clarity that Hermione's logic could not always match. The contrast between the two girls became even starker in the heat of the battle inside the Department of Mysteries. Hermione's planning was meticulous, but when unexpected variables arose, like the sudden collapse of the time room, Luna's adaptability and quick recognition of threats saved them precious moments. "The floor's shifting. They're trying to drive us together," Luna shouted, pulling Ginny away just before a curse exploded where she had been standing. This kind of situational awareness did not come from books, but from Luna's attunement to subtle cues. Looking back, Hermione herself admitted, albeit reluctantly, that she could have been more open to Luna's input. While recounting the events to members of the Order, she said in a low voice, "She saw them before I did. I didn't think it mattered." This was as close to an admission of fault as Hermione allowed herself. It reflected the uncomfortable truth that even the most brilliant minds can fall prey to intellectual arrogance, the assumption that one's own method of reasoning is superior to all others. The scene also revealed the fragility of trust within the group. While they were united against a common enemy, their differences in approach sometimes led to moments of friction. Trust in times of war is not only about loyalty, but also about valuing the strengths of those who see the world differently. Hermione's dismissal of Luna's warning was not born of malice, but of a failure to recognize the validity of alternative perspectives. In a world where Death Eaters hid in plain sight, such oversights could be fatal. It is worth noting that Luna never seemed to hold the incident against Hermione. She continued to treat her with the same serene kindness, offering her copies of the Quibbler and joining her in the room of requirement without hesitation. This lack of resentment spoke volumes about Luna's character. She did not need her perceptions to be validated by others. She trusted them herself. That self-assurance, quiet but unshakable, was something Hermione did not entirely understand, and perhaps even envied. In many ways, the moment in the Forbidden Forest was emblematic of a broader lesson that would follow them into the Battle of Hogwarts. As the final confrontation approached, they faced situations where every scrap of information, no matter how strange, could be the difference between life and death. Luna's knowledge of the secret entrance to Ravenclaw Tower, for instance, came from her peculiar network of observations and conversations, information that, if dismissed, might have cost them a strategic advantage. By then, Hermione had learned enough to listen without immediate judgment. The near disaster also illuminated the tension between reason and intuition. Hermione's strength was in careful planning, but Luna's was in perceiving the unseen. Neither approach alone could have carried them through the war. Together they formed a more complete picture of reality. It was a hard-earned understanding, forged in the crucible of situations where the cost of being wrong was measured in lives. Years later, when the war was long over and they met again at a reunion in the rebuilt Hogwarts, Hermione found herself recalling that moment in the forest. She approached Luna, now an accomplished magi-zoologist, and admitted with a small smile that she had been wrong more than once in underestimating her. Luna, ever enigmatic, simply nodded and said she was glad they had all made it through, before drifting off to speak with Neville about the mating habits of mooncalves. The conversation was brief, but it carried a weight of unspoken acknowledgement. In the end, the incident was a small thread in the vast tapestry of the Second Wizarding War, but it was one that revealed much about the characters involved. Hermione's misjudgment was not catastrophic, but it was close enough to serve as a warning. Even the most improbable voices may hold a fragment of the truth. Sometimes that fragment is all that stands between safety and danger. And in the world they inhabited, danger was never far away. Number 26. Refusing the life-giving potion in the Deathly Hallows. The snow in Godric's Hollow fell silently, blanketing the crooked rooftops and cobblestone streets in a stillness that felt almost ancient. Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley had been trudging through the village for hours, the bitter December wind cutting through their thin layers of clothing. Their supplies were nearly exhausted, and their journey through the British countryside in search of Voldemort's Horcruxes had drained their physical and emotional reserves. It was in this moment of quiet desperation that an old woman appeared from the shadow of a stone cottage. Her back was bent, her hands gnarled, and she carried a clay jug wrapped in rough wool. With an outstretched hand, she offered them something she called living water, a potion so rare, she claimed, it could keep the body warm and restore strength, even in the dead of winter. The smell of frost and wood smoke hung in the air, and the sight of the steaming liquid in the jug sent a surge of longing through Harry's frozen bones. Hermione, ever the voice of caution, took a step back. Her eyes narrowed, and she clutched her wand tightly. She did not touch the jug, did not lean closer to inspect it. To her, the offer reeked of danger, a potential trap. She whispered a curt refusal, her tone sharper than perhaps it needed to be, and the old woman simply nodded, before disappearing into the darkness between houses. Harry and Ron exchanged glances but said nothing. In the days that followed, the decision weighed heavily. They spent nights shivering in their tent, huddled beneath layers of blankets that did little to stop the cold from seeping into their bones. They rationed what little food they had, their energy ebbing away with each sunrise. And somewhere in the back of Harry's mind, the image of that steaming jug lingered. The refusal might have seemed sensible at first. After all, they were in enemy territory where Death Eaters and Snatchers prowled the countryside. But the truth is, Hermione had other options that night. She could have performed a simple specialist revelio to detect concealed enchantments, A quick scourgify on a small sample might have confirmed whether the potion was safe. Even the Aparecium charm could have revealed hidden runes or writing on the jug that might have hinted at its origin. Instead, she acted out of instinct, letting suspicion override any measured assessment. This was not a moment where they were being directly attacked, nor was there any immediate danger pressing them to flee. It was a decision born from fatigue and mistrust, and in retrospect, one that cost them dearly. Rowling never named the concoction living water in the canon, but the scene's mood matches the kind of tension the trio lived under. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Chapter 16, the atmosphere in Godric's Hollow is described in sparse, tense strokes. The snow was deep. Harry and Hermione struggled along the street, the muffled shapes of houses to either side of them. It's in such an environment that any source of warmth or sustenance becomes more than comfort. It becomes survival. Harry, though too focused on the mission to question Hermione in that moment, later thought about how desperate they had been for warmth during those endless nights. The ache in his fingers, the stiff pain in his feet, the rasp in Ron's voice from breathing cold air, all of these might have been eased, if not cured, by what the woman had offered. It is worth noting that Hermione's caution had merit. The war had turned ordinary places into danger zones, and trusting strangers could be fatal. The incident with Bathilda Bagshot only days later would prove her fears justified when the elderly historian's body was discovered to be a disguise for Nagini. Yet there is a difference between recklessness and calculated risk. Hermione was capable of assessing magical objects with speed and precision. She had demonstrated this in the Goblet of Fire when she examined Harry's broom for curses after the match against Victor Crumb, and in the Half-Blood Prince when she analysed the Half-Blood Prince's spells in the margins of the potions textbook. In both cases, she acted with methodical care, proving that she could balance caution with investigation. The cost of her refusal in Godric's Hollow was not measured in poisoned wounds or cursed injuries, but in the slow erosion of the trio's strength. Without any restorative supplies, they relied on meagre meals and what heat they could conjure with spells. Protego Totalum and Muffliato kept them hidden, but even the most advanced warming charms could not fully replace the internal heat that comes from nourishment. They awoke each morning weaker than the last, which made every hike through snow, every tense watch for movement, a greater strain on their bodies. By the time they reached the Forest of Dean, Harry's hands were raw from frostbite, and Ron's lips had cracked to the point of bleeding. One might argue that the woman in Godric's Hollow could have been a Death Eater in disguise, and that Hermione's refusal therefore saved them. But this is speculation, not evidence, and here lies the heart of the issue. Leadership in desperate times is not about eliminating all risk, and it is about distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable risks. By turning away the potion without any attempt to evaluate it, Hermione closed the door on an opportunity that could have shifted the odds in their favour. Her decision reflected not just her distrust of strangers, but perhaps her inability in that moment to adapt her thinking to the pressing reality of their survival needs. The irony is that Hermione herself had often criticized Harry for acting without thinking. In the Philosopher's Stone, she famously declared, "Books and cleverness, there are more important things, friendship and bravery." Yet in Godric's Hollow, cleverness was exactly what was needed. A careful spell, a quick analysis, a small calculated risk. These could have turned the old woman's offer into a boon rather than a threat. In rejecting it outright, Hermione displayed the same kind of impulsive decision-making she often warned against in others, though in her case it was driven by overcaution rather than recklessness. In war, as in life, missed opportunities are not always visible in the moment, but hindsight sharpens them. Imagine if, in those weeks of cold and hunger, Harry had been able to rely on a sip of living water to restore his energy before tracking down the next Horcrux. Imagine if Ron's spirit, already fragile after weeks of bickering and deprivation, had been lifted by a night without shivering. Morale is as critical in a prolonged struggle as food or weapons, and this single resource could have changed the emotional landscape of their journey. There is also a symbolic layer here. Water has always been a potent symbol in the wizarding world, from the purifying waters of the lake in the Triwizard Tournament to the silver fountain in the Ministry of Magic's atrium. It represents renewal and life. To turn away water in a moment of need carries an almost literary weight, as if fate offered a small mercy and it was refused. Whether intentional or not, the scene underscores the isolation and distrust that the war had imposed on them, stripping away their ability to accept help even when it was offered freely. What stings most in recalling this moment is that Hermione, with all her brilliance, could have made the right call without lowering her guard. She could have shielded herself, tested the potion magically, and still kept the upper hand. The tools were in her repertoire, the choice simply wasn't made. The living water was never proven to be safe or dangerous. It simply vanished from their story, a ghost of a possibility that might have altered the hardships to come. For Harry, the memory of that night may have been one of many unspoken regrets. He had learned over and over that victories often hinged on small choices made in fleeting moments. The decision in Godric's Hollow was one such moment, one that slipped away in the shuffle of paranoia and necessity. While they ultimately succeeded in their mission, one wonders how much less they might have suffered had they not been so quick to reject a chance at relief. Ron's later departure from the group, sparked by hunger, cold, and frustration, might have played out differently if their physical needs had been better met. While the Horcrux locket amplified his irritability, it fed on the fertile ground of discomfort and weakness. The living water, whether magical placebo or true restorative, could have deprived the locket of some of that fuel. In this way, Hermione's refusal may have had indirect consequences far beyond a single cold night. It is not fair to lay the full weight of this choice solely on Hermione's shoulders. The burden of leadership in their small band was often shared, and Harry could have spoken up. But Hermione's role as the practical, quick-thinking strategist made her the natural arbiter in situations like this. Her voice carried authority, and in this case, it closed off a path they would never walk. The living water, real or imagined, became one more what if in a journey littered with them. In the end, the episode in Godric's Hollow stands as a subtle but telling example of how fear and caution, while protective in the short term, can sometimes work against survival in the long term. Hermione's choice, perhaps born from the very qualities that kept them alive, also denied them a chance to be stronger, warmer, and better prepared. In the chill of that winter, the absence of the living water was felt in every aching muscle, every sleepless night, and every shiver that no charm could truly banish.